fancy picture. You might recognize this guy from, hospitals and textbooks and that kind of stuff. If you aren't familiar with him or you've never seen him before, this is the Vitruvian Man. Has a fancy name for a guy that is standing naked with his arms and legs kind of spread in a weird way. If you've never heard of him, you've probably at least heard of Leonardo da Vinci, a very famous artist, also insanely talented inventor. He was also really, really interested in science and the human body, especially intrigued him. He actually was the one that drew this guy, and he did so in a way to kind of just understand the body. He was very interested in how the body related to like the physical world. There's a lot of cool information about the Vitruvian Man. If you want to check it out, you can look at Wikipedia. But I always include him on the first page because it's kind of, I don't know, I think of him kind of like the mascot for human anatomy, human physiology. You see him, like I said, in places like textbooks and hospitals. So imagine if you never really recognized him before, you'll probably see him now that you kind of know a little bit about him. But nothing really related to the class other than I just kind of think he's kind of cool. So let's actually talk about some human body stuff. All right, since this is human anatomy, I think it's pretty important that we define what that is, what that term means, along with another term that I've already been saying a few different points this morning, physiology, what that term is, how those two different areas of study relate to one another. I know some of you guys are taking both anatomy and physiology this semester. I will be teaching phys this afternoon at noon, and some of you guys are joining in for that as well. Okay, these are the two branches of science that provide us the foundation for understanding our body's parts and our functions. Okay, anatomy can be described as the study of structure of an organism and the relationship of its parts. So key term here related to anatomy is structure. So in other words, how we're built, okay, how we're put together, okay. In this case, since this is human anatomy, we're studying the structure of us, organism, for the human body and the relationship of its parts, okay, which can be done at kind of various levels. Okay, gross anatomy can be described as the study of body parts visible to the naked eye. So like looking around the room or looking up on my screen and I see you guys, I can see things like your hair color, your skin color. We can look at the back of our hand and see the wrinkles and the different hairs that we have. We say gross, it's not gross as in like, ew, yuck, I'm dissecting a dead body. And gross in this case means, you can see it, like I said, with the naked eye, it's a whole large structure, okay? What we're gonna be doing going into lecture 2 and lecture 3 later on this week and into next week is looking at things that are not visible to the naked eye, so we need a microscope. Microscopic anatomy includes the study of cells, what we call cytology, and the study of tissues, what we call histology, okay? Now, one thing I'm gonna kind of warn you guys is this semester, you're gonna be learning a lot of new words that are probably not so common to native English speakers, because a lot of the words that we deal with in science and in this class are rooted in Latin, okay? So your textbook has a list of prefixes and suffixes that you can find that help you understand what that prefix, what the beginning of the word means, what the end of a word means. The great thing is now we all have cell phones where you can type in a word to Google and 2 seconds later know what that word means. But I encourage students, on tests when they come across a word that they might not recognize, hopefully that's not the case. But if it's a big word and you don't know what it means, you can sometimes break it down into its parts and then kind of figure it out. Okay? Imagine everybody's been exposed to the ending of a word that goes with ology, maybe like in the class biology, okay? Ology is a suffix that means study of, okay? And you can see cytology, histology, both in that way. Well, I bet you can figure out what histo and cyto mean. Now that you know what ology means, cyto is a prefix that means cells, and hist or histo refers to tissues. Okay, so that's kind of a thing I always try to focus on. Try to break down words into their different parts, and that will help you if you're not quite sure what you're dealing with. Comparative anatomy is the study of one or more species in order to learn generalizations, evolutionary trends, like comparing our skeleton to the skeleton of a bird or something like that. We don't really do that in this class. It's more of a biology type thing. Okay. Now in this class, we will obviously be focusing on anatomy because that's the name of the class, human anatomy, but we will also learn a lot about physiology. Okay, not nearly as much as what I talk about in the class physiology, but physiology is a science that deals with the function of the living organism and its parts. So in other words, anatomy is more of like identifying this part. Physiology is understanding what that part does. Okay, so structure, key for anatomy, function, keyword for physiology. Okay, and just like with anatomy, physiology can be viewed at different levels or branches. The type of organism involved can be viewed, like in the case of what we will be talking about in this class, human physiology. If you were to take like botany, you talk about plant physiology, how plants work. You can look at physiology at the organizational level, which we're going to talk about organizational levels here on the very next slide, like in the case of molecular or cellular phys. And then we can also look at it at the systemic level, where you're talking about, you know, a body system like the respiratory system or the cardiovascular system and how those systems work. Table 1.1 is a table that you're actually going to find in your textbook if you actually were to download it and open it up. Not a table that you really need to worry about. I only included it because it was in your textbook. It includes on the left different branches of anatomy and on the right branches of physiology, but nothing really I'm not worried about, you know. Okay, let's talk about levels of organization. Yes? Can you not hear me now? Oh, I was just letting everybody write. Sorry, I wasn't talking. Yeah, I try not to talk while students write because I found that students don't actually hear what I say when they're writing. So I usually give them a minute or two to let everybody fill out the blanks, and then I ramble. And if I do talk while you're writing things down, don't hesitate to have me repeat it.
I have a question, sir.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are we supposed to be filling this out on the canvas because it won't let me?
No, I was hoping you would be able to print it off. What you can do is just I'll have these printed off for you going forward. But for today, if you just want to take like on a piece of scratch paper, and
Yeah,
then,
I'm writing it down.
and then you can go in and fill it in once you have the copy printed off.
Okay.
All right, if you didn't get all that, I will be back down, so I promise you will get all those blanks filled. Okay, let's talk about the way that our bodies organize. What we have and all living things have are a pretty amazing way of how we're built, how we're put together. Okay, we're organized very, very neatly and precisely. Starting at the very basic level is the chemical level. And then progressively, as we go down the page, we become more complex, or the levels become more complex. Now, some organisms, like in the case of like bacteria, they only have 2 levels, okay? The chemical level, the cellular level, and that's because bacteria are just single-celled organisms. Some, like sponges, for example, are going to just have 3 levels, okay? But we are complex machines. Other organisms are, fairly complex like us, or really complex like us, like other animals. So they probably have all 6 levels, but not all living organisms have all 6 levels. We do though, okay? Let's start at the top. Once again, the basic, simplest level is the chemical level. This is a level that we really don't talk a whole lot about in this class. I get into chemicals and stuff like that more in physiology. This is where you're going to be talking about atoms. Each atom throughout our body is a small particle with a unique identity. That's going to be made up of things like protons, neutrons, electrons, something you probably learned about maybe back in high school in a biology or a chemistry class. And I'm sure everybody's seen the periodic table of elements, each of the little boxes in the periodic table, like, the carbon box or the hydrogen box has numbers in it. That tells you how many protons, how many electrons, how many neutrons would be in one atom of that element. The most important, or the essential atoms that are going to build our body and are essential for our life, will be the first 4 especially, and then you've got phosphorus, calcium, and sulfur listed as well. But like 96% of our body is made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. What you're not going to find if you were to, crack us open, for lack of a better way to say it, will be just like carbon and a bulk hydrogen in place. What you're going to find is that atoms don't just hang out by themselves typically. Instead, they combine and form molecules, which is where you have 2 or more atoms bonded together. Examples important to us would be like DNA. I'm sure you've all heard DNA, glucose, which is a fancy term for like our blood sugar. H2O, I'm sure everybody knows what that is. That's water made up of 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen. A couple different examples. You can take molecules, you can combine them to form larger units called organelles, which are like the tiniest functioning machines of our body that perform a specific function. Examples include ribosomes that make our proteins, mitochondria that I imagine most of you guys or everybody's heard the term or phrase powerhouse of the cell. We'll talk more about those in our next lecture and learn what they do. And I imagine that'll be a review from when you were a freshman in high school and taking biology. Cellular level is the next number 2 there. Cells are the smallest and most numerous structure units possessing and exhibiting basic characteristics of living matter. So in other words, our cells are the first and the smallest living things. They're made up of many different organelles. We have an entire lecture dedicated to cells. That's our next lecture that we'll be talking about them in great detail. One thing that's very amazing is everything that we are able to do and everything that we do is a result of the function of our cells. Being able to contract the muscles that you're using to take your notes right now is thanks to the skeletal muscle cells inside your forearm muscles. Me speaking right now involves neurons sending signals down from our brain. Neurons are special brain cells and nervous system cells, producing saliva and digesting food. It's all about ourselves. Okay, it's pretty amazing. But we all began our life as a single cell, what we call a zygote, that's formed. And nobody likes to think about this, but when the sperm from dad and the egg from mom united, zygote was formed. That zygote then goes through cell division. 1 cell becomes 2 cells that become eventually us, made up of trillions upon trillions of cells. Number 3 there, tissue level. A tissue is a group of similar cells that all develop together to form the same gross structure. So basically, if you want to kind of think of it a simpler way, a group of cells that work together. If you want to say that way, it's pretty easy. 4 principal types of tissues exist in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Each of them has a different job. Epithelial is going to be like what covers the body surface, like the outer surface of our skin, the inside of our mouth, inside of our stomach, our sweat glands, our oil glands, endocrine glands internally. Those are all epithelial types of tissue. Connective obviously connects, it's the name, but it also supports and protects body organs and distributes blood vessels to other tissues. There's a lot of different connective tissues. You know, blood is a connective, so is your fat, so is cartilage. So there's a lot of variability there. There's 3 different types of muscle. When you think of muscle, you're probably going to think of like the muscles that move our body, like, you know, when you walk across the room or you jump up and down. Those are skeletal muscles that move our body parts. But we've also got muscle internally, like in our stomach, to help us digest our food. Our heart is essentially a muscle that helps us pump our blood. And then nervous tissue is the most complex, but it carries information from one part of the body to another through nerve impulses. And this is what makes up like our brain and spinal cord. We'll talk a lot about tissues. We have an entire lecture dedicated to them and learn about the different forms of those principal types. You can take a couple of different tissues and you can build an organ. So definition of an organ is a structure made up of several different kinds. In other words, at least 2 tissues arranged so that together they perform a special function. Examples include the heart that I was just mentioning, your stomach that I've mentioned, any skeletal muscle. In our figure here, they've got the stomach shown, made up of, looks like some muscle there, some epithelial, some connective tissues. So there's at least 2 tissues making it up. So that's why it's an organ. Then at the 5th level is the systemic level or system level. System is defined as several organs arranged so that they can perform complex functions. So in other words, it's a collection of organs like, you know, your liver, your gallbladder, your small intestine, your large intestine. They collectively perform a function or functions for the body. Once we've kind of got these first 3 lectures done, we're going to go through all 11 systems of the body one by one. Okay, so that's kind of the way that we attack the class, beginning with the integumentary system and then the skeletal system and so on and so forth. Okay, what we'll see at some points is an organ like the pancreas that we talk about when we talk about the endocrine system about midway through the semester. And then at the end of the semester, we'll talk about it again because it's also digestive in function. So one organ can have kind of overlapping functions and belong to 2 different organ systems, which is really cool. And then once we've talked about all of those 11 systems, we'll have completed the class, we'll have talked about the organism, us, the sum total of all structural levels working together to promote life. Okay. So as I mentioned, you're going to see a lot of pictures, and kind of just as a forewarning, if there's a picture in your notes, there's a good chance it's going to show up on the exam, unless I kind of tell you, don't worry about that picture. Okay. In the case of this picture, it's from your textbook, but it's not a picture I'm going to expect you to know or identify on the exam. So you don't need to worry about studying it. It's just an illustration of the different things that we talked about up top. Okay. As I just was mentioning back here on this previous page, the way that we spend most of our time this semester is going system by system. So throughout this course, you will learn about anatomy and physiology of the body systems. Listed below the very general functions of the systems we will cover. You will learn as we proceed through this class that all body systems influence one another. What I've done is just kind of created a basic table with the 11 systems, starting with integumentary all the way down to reproductive, what structures or components that are part of that system, and then what that system does for us in a very, very, very general way. Okay. What we'll learn is in much greater detail what's actually happening as we go through them, but I kind of just want to introduce them. I'm not going to actually read through it all, and it's not something I'm going to ask you to study for the exam because we're going to cover it all in much greater detail. If this is all I wanted you to know, the semester will be over after this slide. Obviously, that's not the case. Okay, so this is kind of just a brief overview of what you'll be seeing this semester. And it goes through the exact same order that we will run through. So we start with the integumentary, then we move on eventually. In this semester, we'll talk about penises and vaginas. So we'll have that to look forward to. For now, we'll just move on to really our kind of first true lecture slide here on some anatomy and identification stuff. All right, I'm going to introduce you guys into a concept called anatomical position. This is something we're going to kind of deal with all semester long. One thing that we're going to do a lot of this semester is describe the location of something, okay, where something is located in the body, whether it's like where the heart is, where the lungs are, where the spleen is, etc. Okay. Well, when you describe where something's at, you might also need to describe where something's at in relationship to another term or to another structure, I mean. Okay. So you need a baseline or a starting point, and that's what anatomical position is. And if we have this lady and we pretend that she's in a standing position, she's demonstrating here on the left side perfect anatomical position. Okay. And by anatomical position, we know that she's got her face and head pointed directly forward. Her arms are down there at her waist. Her palms are facing forward, so the front of her hands are facing forward, not looking at the back of her hand. And her feet are roughly width, or they're shorter width and separation. Okay. When we view this lady, okay, or if this was a cadaver and we had them on a table and we were viewing them, we have to view their left and their right as they really truly are. Okay, I would assume everybody would agree with me that this is the left side of the image, correct? Is that her left arm though? No, that is her right arm. Okay, and it's going to be very important that you keep your right and left straight and forward, because as you'll see on the very last slide here of this lecture, that plays a big role in where things are. So keeping left and right is very important. It's not such a big deal when you're looking at the posterior view, the back view here, because this is the right side of the image, is the right arm. But over here, it definitely does play a role. Now, like I said, if we were to say that this was not a person standing, but instead laying on a table, you can lay a body down on a table in kind of two different positions, in a prone or a supine position. So if we're looking at this lady laying on her back, as we pretend she's a cadaver laying on an exam room table, we'd say that she's in a supine position. So if you're a back sleeper like myself, you like to sleep in like what's called the supine position. If you're a belly sleeper, if you like to lay your face down, you sleep in a what we call prone position, where the body's face down. So that's kind of a common set of terms that we use this semester. And we'll use the terms pronate, supinate later on as well. Now, pictured here, we can see a lot of different things are labeled from the head all the way down to the toes. We see kind of two terms, at least anyway, for each of those different structures. Common term like armpit is in parentheses. And then not in parentheses is what we call the anatomical term. These are the terms that are used not only in this class, but basically in any medical scientific field. So, you know, in the doctor's office, you know, they're not going to call it, you know, the armpit, they're going to refer to it as the axillary region. Okay. These are absolutely essential for you guys to learn because it's what we'll be using all semester long, not just here in unit 1, but all semester long. And an easy way to demonstrate the importance of knowing these anatomical terms, I have students do this, okay? Tell your student to point to your biceps muscle. So everybody do that right now. And everybody's gonna point to their upper arm because that's where your biceps muscle is, right? That's where one of the biceps muscles is. Okay, and then I always tell students point to the other biceps muscle, but don't point to your other arm. And that's where I generally get the look that I'm getting right now, like what the hell is he talking about? Well, that's because your upper arm is where you find the biceps brachii, short for brachial, okay, which also happens to be home of things like your brachial artery and your brachial vein, your brachial nerve. There's another muscle in there called the brachialis. So the term brachial is something that you're going to see a lot this semester, okay? There's also, in another part of the body, what we call the biceps femoris muscle, okay? The biceps femoris is one of your hamstring muscles, and it's called the biceps femoris because it's in your femoral region. That's home to your femur, your big upper leg bone. Guess what arteries in your femoral region? Your femoral artery, your femoral vein, your femoral nerve, okay? These terms are used all semester long, okay? And I know it seems really daunting right away to learn like 200 different things, but I promise you it's going to pay off tremendously. And there will be points in the semester where I say, hey, remember all those anatomical terms? You're going to say, yeah, he was right. So learn them and you'll be reaping the benefits all semester long, okay? Now, these two images, I can guarantee you at least one of them will show up in your first exam, okay? Like I showed you guys with that practice exam, I think I had this one included on there. I might put this picture and I can get the picture digitally without all the blanks or all these lines. And what I like to do on exams is like give you a list of like 6 things and say label them. And so you draw in your own lines, or sometimes I get them where the line's already included and you just have to match it. Okay. What I'm not going to ever do for you guys on an exam is give you a blank picture and say label it and not tell you what to label. I'm not going to ask you to label all 200 different things on this picture or however many number it is. Okay. So I'll kind of pick and choose. Okay. But I can tell you right now, at least one of them, if not both of them, will be on exam 1. Sound good? And as you mutter, holy crap, this class is going to be tough. It will be, but if you work hard, you'll be in good shape. Okay, we have some more terms to learn. All right, you can get those all written out. I'll be back down in a little bit. As I was just mentioning back here on this previous page, one thing we do a lot of is describing where things are in relationship to one another. So, you know, for example, where is the elbow compared to the wrist? Okay. Well, instead of using terms like above, below, in front of, behind, we use these fancier, what we call directional terms. Okay. So another set of terms that might not be as common in your everyday language, but are terms that you're going to want to know because we will use them all semester long. Okay. The first two that I have listed here in this table, superior and inferior, are directly the opposite of one another. Okay. Now, superior can also go by the term cephalic or cranial. Caudal could be used instead of inferior. In the case of these, I just care about you knowing them as superior and inferior. Okay. Superior is going to refer to towards the head or the upper part of a structure, whereas inferior is away from the head or the lower part of the structure. Okay. Well, once again, going back to why we need anatomical position, if we had one arm above the head and a knee bent or something like that, then that really kind of makes it tough to tell what's towards the head, what's below the head, that kind of stuff. Okay. And if the person's standing up, it'd be easy to say, oh yeah, the elbow is superior to the wrist, it's above it, right? Okay, but what if this person's laying down and you instead say above? Well, then people might infer like above is farther from the earth. So it's just kind of confusing in that way. So instead, we're going to use superior and inferior. Okay. Now, something I didn't mention that I meant to is, since we do a lot of identification and we deal with a lot of pictures in this class, I actually recommend students, especially if you're a visual learner, to grab a pack of like colored pencils and bring them to class, because there'll be times where we kind of like color pictures to help understand what that term means. In this case, if you had these colored pencils, obviously you couldn't do that since I'm just now telling you, but you could, if in theory, color these little arrows, because these arrows are demonstrating what some of these terms mean. For example, letter A, this arrow represents the term superior, whereas letter H represents inferior. Okay. The next two terms, anterior and posterior, those are the most commonly used, I say, by me, but I also want you to know ventral and dorsal. Anterior means near to or at the front of the body. So like your nose on the anterior side of your body. Okay. Whereas your butt is on the posterior side. Okay. In fact, sometimes people call their butt their posterior, right? Okay. If you're familiar with sharks, you've probably heard the term dorsal fin, right? Okay, that's the fin that sticks up out of the water. That is on the back of the shark. That's why it gets its name as the dorsal fin. So in our figure here, B would be anterior, C would be posterior. Okay. Medial and lateral, those are the opposite of one another. Medial refers to nearer to the midline. Basically, your midline is the middle of your body, where you could draw a line. Obviously, we wouldn't do this, but an imaginary line going right down through the center of your body that would perfectly cut you in half, left and right. The closer you are to that, the more medial you are. Think medial for middle, right? Okay. Your heart is pretty darn medial because your heart's almost centered in the body, so is your nose. Your nose would actually get split in half by that imaginary midline. Okay. Letter E represents what lateral means, farther from the midline. Okay. So if you use these terms in a sentence, you'd say your heart is blank to your lungs, and you'd put in heart is medial to your lungs because it's more towards the midline. Okay. What we don't use a lot in this class, I'll be honest, are the next three terms, or excuse me, the intermediate, ipsilateral, contralateral. Intermediate is going to refer to between two structures. So like your heart is intermediate to your lungs. Okay, this is not something we do a whole lot of. Ipsilateral, contralateral refer to on the same side of the body as another structure or on the opposite side of the body of another structure. So in the case of like your right arm and your right leg are ipsilateral, whereas your right leg and your left leg are contralateral. Like very rarely, if ever, will I say those terms other than right here. So don't really worry too much about those. Make sure you know them, but you won't see them very often, or if at all, going forward. Okay, proximal and distal, those go together, and those are going to be used a lot when we talk about like the arms and legs. Proximal refers to near to the attachment of a limb to the trunk or the origination of the structure, Whereas distal, I always tell students think distant. It's farther away from that attachment of the limb to the trunk or farther from the origination of the structure. So when we talk about the arms and legs, where they attach to the trunk, your arms attached to your trunk at the shoulder, your legs attached to your trunk at the hips, okay? Well, going back, I think I said the terms or the regions of the body, elbow and wrist, right? Okay. Well, we could say our elbow is blank to the wrist. Well, we could say it's superior, it's towards the head, right? Okay. Well, your elbow is also proximal to your wrist because it's closer to your shoulder. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So letters F for proximal, letter G for distal. And then superficial, I also want you to know external. Hopefully those are pretty common sense, and deep internal. Know both of those hopefully are pretty common sense. Letter J will be deep. Letter I would be superficial. Okay, towards the surface in the case of superficial. Deep will be away from the surface. Okay. These two figures here on the right, I actually snagged from a different textbook. I like them because they have the arrows. This is what your textbook actually has for the image representing some of those terms, but neither of those images are important to know. I just included them to hopefully make some sense of things. Okay, some other commonly used terms that you're going to see a lot this semester. Lumen is going to refer to the hollow area of an organ. And we find that a lot of our organs are hollow structures, like your stomach, for example, where your food might be sitting right now. And I say sitting, it's obviously not just hanging out, relaxing, but it's being sloshed around. If you had breakfast anyway, that is the hollow area of an organ. Okay. Central, probably, hopefully common sense, means near the center of an organ, whereas peripheral means near the boundary. So, you know, if like this is like a blood vessel, this will be the central part, this will be the peripheral part. Okay. Medullary and cortical, those are the opposite of one another. The version here that's in bold is the adjective, whereas medulla and cortex, those are the noun version of that term. Medulla or medullary refers to the inner region of an organ, whereas cortical is the outer part of an organ. So kind of like central, peripheral. When we talk about the adrenal glands that sit on your kidneys, your adrenal glands can be broken down into an adrenal medulla and an adrenal cortex. Okay, your adrenal medulla, for example, is where adrenaline comes from. Okay. And then base and apex or basal apical refer to triangular shaped organs, like this triangle that I included here, which is kind of drawn in a weird way. Generally, people don't draw triangles like this. But this is what actually your heart looks like in a very, very basic way. The widest part of an organ that's triangular would be the base, and actually the heart has a base that sits on top. And then the point or the tip of an organ is its apex. So actually the bottom of your heart is where it comes to a point, and that's because your heart is an inverted triangle, kind of at that cockeyed way that it is there. Same thing, basal and apical, that's adjective, base and apex, that would be the noun version of that term. Once again, no pictures on that page you need to worry about though for the exam. All right, let's talk about body planes. Body planes are imaginary flat surfaces that pass through the body. Think of them, if you want, like a pane of glass, okay? Where you could view the body in these different ways. like from the, just straight on anterior or frontal view, like what you show here. Or if you turn the body 90 degrees, you can look at it from the side and view it using that sagittal plane. Speaking of the sagittal plane, let's go ahead and talk about that. A vertical plane running from front to back divides the body into left and right sides. So it runs through that medial line that I was talking about. It's the midline. If we're talking about a mid-sagittal plane or median plane, and that is going to create equal right and left sides of the body, which is what's shown here with this thin blue line. Whereas we don't always have to view it in that manner. We can also, look at it from what we call the parasagittal plane, which is offset from the midline and would create unequal right and left sides. Okay. A frontal or coronal plane is a vertical plane running from from side to side. So it's also vertical, but since we're looking at it from the straight on view here, we can see it very nicely in pink. I like the term frontal better than coronal because it's kind of easy to just remember. It creates a front and a back, although I just told you guys we're not going to really use those terms. Instead, we'll use anterior, posterior. For whatever reason, the textbook publishers kind of are now pushing coronal, or I don't know if that's a scientific reason why, but I generally use frontal, but I want you to also know coronal. Transverse, this is our first horizontal plane. So the first two, frontal and sagittal, are vertical. Transverse is a term you're going to see a lot this semester. Kind of one of those situations I was mentioning earlier where you've got a prefix trans. Trans is a term or a prefix that means like across. So in other words, not up and down, but across the body, crosswise plane, which creates superior and inferior parts. Okay, in this case, they're cutting right through the belly button, but no, you can do that, somewhere above or below that as well. Other terms for this same plane is a cross-sectional or horizontal plane, but I use transverse more often than not. And then an oblique plane passes through the body of an organ or an organ at an angle between a transverse plane and a sagittal plane, or between a transverse plane and a frontal plane. So oblique, it's not vertical or horizontal, it's somewhere kind of in the middle. Okay. And that's shown down there at the bottom. I do want you to know this figure here on the left side of the page, showing you these different planes. So be able to identify them. You might see this lady on the exam or a lady like that, and you will find this same picture in your labeling packet. What you won't find, and I'm not worried about you knowing these figures, but those illustrate what's called a section. Section is a cut of the body or one of its organs made along one of those planes just described. So in other words, a way in order to cut the body, or in this case, the brain. Okay. When you guys do your virtual dissections, you'll be doing cutting, and I say that obviously loosely, but you'll be clicking and it will do the cutting for you along these different planes. If you were to cut the brain in half from front to back, you'd be performing what's called a mid-sagittal section. If you cut the front of the brain off and you look at the interior of it, you'd be performing a frontal section. And if you cut the top of the brain off, you'd look down into it, you'd have performed a transverse section. So it's pretty cool. And as you can see, the word section is why we call cuts of the body a dissection. Okay. So if you ever wonder where that term comes from, now you know. Okay, let's talk about body cavities. Defining body cavities, there are spaces within our body that help protect, separate, and support our internal organs. So basically, it's these spaces where our organs are at and they're organized. So our organs aren't just kind of floating around the body like a raft on a lazy river. Obviously, that's not the case. Okay. We can break our cavities down into kind of whether they're anterior or ventral and whether they're posterior or dorsal. As we just learned those terms, anterior means towards the front of the body, posterior means towards the back. Okay. Two major anterior cavities are the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavities. Very large cavities, especially the abdominal pelvic, which is the largest of the body. Thoracic also goes by chest cavity. It's formed by the ribs, the muscles of the chest, the sternum, and the thoracic portion of our vertebral column. And this is where you're going to find your heart and your lungs, along with some other organs. Shown here in blue on our two figures. Actually, you can take your thoracic cavity and break it down into a few smaller cavities because of some membranes, which we'll talk about. We're not going to get to that today, but on the next slide, we'll talk about these membranes that surround some of the organs. Okay, surrounding each lung are the right and left pleural cavities. You'll see the word plural or pleura from time to time this semester. It always refers to lungs. Okay. A smaller space in between those two cavities is the space around our heart called the pericardial cavity. Kind of the same thing, cardia, cardiac, cardiole, like plural. In this case, cardia, cardiac, cardiole refers to heart. Okay. And kind of anatomical landmark within our thoracic cavity is a place called the mediastinum. It's not it's kind of think of like an X marks the spot. That's obviously, where you find treasure. There's not, an X where the mediastinum is. It's just an imaginary spot right in the middle of your thoracic cavity. So it would be like right there. Abdominal pelvic cavity extends from our diaphragm to the groin. And the diaphragm is this muscle here that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. It is a large cavity where we find a lot of digestive organs. All the way down to our pelvis area where you find, some reproductive and urinary organs. You can actually separate the abdominal pelvic cavity into two subcavities. The abdominal cavity is where the liver, gallbladder, pancreas, stomach, intestine, spleen, and kidneys are. And then the pelvic cavity, that's where more of your reproductive and urinary structures are. But notice here in both figures, we are showing that there's no true divider. Okay, that's why we've got a dotted line going across. There's no structure that separates them. Basically, it's just the top of the hips that is used to kind of imaginarily note the difference between those two cavities. Organs that are collectively found inside your thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity are called viscera. So like your lungs, your heart, your spleen, we call those visceral organs. You'll hear that term visceral a lot this semester. The two posterior cavities include the cranial cavity. That's where your brain is located. It's inside your skull, formed by the cranial bones. And then the vertebral cavity, or as you can see, it's called a canal here. Also goes by spinal cavity or spinal canal. Is where you find your spinal cord, and that's formed by the spinal column in your vertebrae. Okay. Now, your brain and your spinal cord are very, very delicate tissues, and your bones that surround them are not. So to protect them in between our delicate nervous tissues and the bones are these things called meninges that we'll talk about later on the semester. Imagine most of you guys have heard the term meningitis before. That is a situation where those meninges are infected, okay, whether it's bacterial or viral. Okay. In addition to those major body cavities, we'll also examine other body cavities in future lectures. Include your mouth or oral cavity where your tongue and your teeth are, nasal cavity inside your nose where they'll stick a swab up there. It feels like touching your brain to test you for COVID. Orbital cavities or orbits, that's where your eyeballs are. Tympanic cavities are in your middle ear, that's where your ear bones are. And synovial cavities, which are associated with all your further joints. I do want you to know this image, so put a big fat, or I guess it's two images, put a star on it, highlight it, whatever you need to do. But this is one you might see in a few weeks. Okay, I'm gonna stop here. We're gonna pick up with thoracic and abdominal cavity membranes on Thursday.